Good evening, everyone. It's been a while since I've been up here. It feels like that anyway. So first of all, I want to thank Rick for filling in for me last week while I was traveling. If you want to open up your lesson books, we are in Lesson 11, which is page 23. Lesson 11, page 23. So last week, Rick walked you through where we were at in 1 Kings, where we had previously learned about how David, towards the end of his reign as king of Israel, he had become weak in his old age, and so his health was declining. And one of his sons, Adenaija, saw this as an opportunity. He saw this as an opportunity to make a play for the throne, right? And so last week you kind of walked through reasons why he was motivated to do such a thing, some of the people who were backing him. And so now that brings us into 1 Kings chapter 1, starting in verse 11. And so I'm going to go ahead and just read that, probably more for my benefit than yours. 1 Kings chapter 1. And we're starting in verse 11. It says, Then Nathan spoke to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, saying, Have you not heard that Adenaija, the son of Haggith, has become king, and David our Lord does not know it? So now come, please let me give you advice, and save your life and the life of your son Solomon. Go at once to King David and say to him, Have you not, my lord the king, sworn to your servant, saying, Solomon, your son, shall certainly be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne? Why then has Adenaija become king? Behold, while you are still there speaking with the king, I will come in after you and confirm your words. So Bathsheba entered to the king in the bedroom. Now the king was very old, and Abishag the Shunammite was serving the king. If you remember, she was the one who was essentially hired to keep him warm because he had trouble keeping his body warm at that age. Then Bathsheba bowed down and prostrated herself before the king, and the king said, What is on your mind? She said to him, My lord, you yourself swore to your servant by the Lord your God, saying, Your son Solomon shall certainly be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne. But now behold, Adenaija is king. And now, my lord the king, you do not know it. He has sacrificed oxen and fattened steers and sheep in abundance, and has inherited all the sons of the king, Abiathar the priest, and Joab the commander of the army, but he has not invited Solomon your servant. And as for you, my lord the king, the eyes of all of Israel are upon you, to announce to them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise it will come about as soon as my lord the king lies down with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon will be considered offenders. And behold, while she was still speaking with the king, Nathan the prophet came in. They informed the king, saying, Nathan the prophet is here. When he came into the king's presence, he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. Then Nathan said, My lord, the king, have you yourself said, Adenaija shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne? For he has gone down today, and he has sacrificed oxen and fattened steers and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the king's sons, the commanders of the army, and Abiathar the priest, and behold, they are eating and drinking in his presence. And they say, Long live King Adenaija. But me, even me, your servant, Zadok the priest, Benaniah the son of Jehoiada, and your servant Solomon, he is not invited. Has this thing been done by my lord the king, and have you not let your servants know who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him? Then King David responded and said, Summon Bathsheba to me. And she came into the king's presence and stood before the king. Then the king vowed and said, As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, certainly, as I have vowed to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, Your son Solomon certainly shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place, and I will indeed do so this day. Then Bathsheba bowed with her face to the ground and prostrated herself before the king and said, "May my lord King David live forever." Then King David said, "Summon to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada." And they came in to the king's presence. And the king said to them, "Take with you the servants of your lord, and have my son Solomon ride down on my own mule and bring him down to Gihon. And have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him there as king over Israel, and blow the trumpet and say, 'Long live King Solomon.' Then you shall come up after him, and he shall come and sit on my throne, and he shall be king in my place. For I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and Judah." Benaiah the son of Jehoiada answered the king and said, "Amen. May the Lord, the God of my lord the king, say the same. Just as the Lord has been with my lord the king, so may he be with Solomon, and make his throne greater than the throne of my lord King David." So Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, the Cherethites, the Pelethites, went down and had Solomon ride on King David's mule and brought him to Gihon. And Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. Then they blew the trumpet, and all the people said, "Long live King Solomon." And all the people went up after him, and the people were playing on flutes and rejoicing with great joy, so that the earth shook with their noise. So, quite a long reading, but it sets up a good picture of this entire episode that we're going to go over tonight. So to start with, question 7 asks us to name Solomon's most important supporters and then what role they played. So who were Solomon's most important supporters?
Nathan the prophet.
Nathan the prophet, okay. Bathsheba, okay. And what were their roles?
Bathsheba was the queen and she was his mother. And Nathan was the priest. Or, no, he was the prophet. Zadok was the priest.
Yeah. Yeah, so, oh, go ahead, Rick.
Sorry. Okay, so David might have been the most important one, and he appointed Solomon the king, right?
Sure.
He said he's going to follow. And I had down that, like, if I can read my own writing, I think Nathan anointed him.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? And then Bathsheba was the one that reminded David of.
Yeah.
And really let him know what was going on.
Yeah. And I would say maybe his most important supporter was God, right? Because he said his favor will not depart from him. So I could have made that a trick question, but yeah. But yeah, he had some pretty influential people backing him, right? So he had Nathan and Bathsheba and David. And what was Nathan's plan to counter Adonijah's usurping of the throne, right? So Nathan's the one that kind of instigated this. Adonijah's making this play for the throne, right? He's trying to secure the power for himself, and Nathan has this plan to set in motion to counteract this, right? So what is this plan?
They'll go in and talk to David. Bathsheba will go in, and then while she's talking, he'll come in, and it'll seem like, not just seem like, he'll recognize that it's this catastrophe happening. He'll have to make a decision.
Yeah, so he's saying that if you go in first and say, "Hey, do you know what's going on? Was this something that you orchestrated? Like it's your will, David, that you want Adonijah on the throne? Were you aware of that? And remember what you said before to me?" And then Nathan's going to come in and confirm this, right? So the way that they're orchestrating this, you notice it's tactful. There's no deceit here. So Nathan is organizing this with Bathsheba behind the scenes, but it's not like he's saying, "Go in and lie, and then I'll come in and I'll support your lie." He's saying, "Go in and state the facts, and when I come in and confirm it, it'll be that much more powerful." So this is a good way. They could have barged into David and just been yelling at them back and forth like, "You said this and this is going on." But they used some wisdom and tact here. Rick?
Yeah, if you remember, they're out of the mouths of two witnesses,
Yes.
everything is supposed to be confirmed. Right?
Yes. Absolutely.
That was an important thing for them.
That's a great verse to back this up. And we this is a critical time for Israel, right? Anytime that there's a change in leadership, those are times when a nation is most vulnerable, right? I know that a lot of us have probably felt that same way, over the last several elections. It's always a question of, will things go peacefully or will things not go peacefully, right? And sometimes there are people who challenge one outcome or another. So this is something that I think all of us can certainly agree with. And the more confusion that you have with these things, the worse it gets. It just spirals out of control, which is one of the reasons why Nathan really pushed for this to happen quickly. Confusion was starting to mount. If you notice, he said that Adenaija had already gone down in front of people in a very public way, and he had been taking steps to make it seem like he had been appointed king. There were sacrifices offered. He had invited in other important people, commanders and priests. He was getting people to make a showing so that the people of Israel would think this was a legitimate claim, right? So he was making that push. And if they hadn't responded quickly, there's a good chance that people wouldn't have believed later. If Bathsheba and Nathan had acted too late, there's a good chance they wouldn't have believed them, right? But they do act quickly. Question 9, though, says, why were the lives of Solomon and Bathsheba considered to be in danger? Remember, Nathan brought this up. He said that you need to do this for your sakes, right? So Nathan feels that there's a very real threat to the lives of Solomon and Bathsheba. And why would he think that?
Well, because a lot of times when a new king takes office, takes place, he'll kill a lot of what he considers his competition.
Right.
Someone that stands in his way.
Yeah, you got to get rid of anyone who has a claim to the throne in some way, right? Whether they have a claim through a bloodline, whether they have a claim through military power or something like that. A lot of kings would get rid of their rivals so that they would be undisputed. There would be nobody else,
Well,
right?
he also knew that David had planned on Solomon being king. So
Right.
that would be another reason to get rid of Solomon.
Yeah, exactly. Question 10 says, what action was ordered by David to put down the usurpation attempt and to establish the government in the hand of Solomon? And then they want to name 3 points. So they bring this up before David. And David, while he is weak, he's old, but he's still all there in his mind. And so he recognizes what's going on. And in his wisdom, he puts forth a way to squash this completely, right? So David responds to this and gives some orders, and there are at least three things that he commands to happen. So what are those 3 things?
Well, first he has him ride on David's mule.
He has him ride on David's mule.
That would be a privilege
Right.
to do that. Not everybody can ride on the king's animal.
Right.
So that was setting him up to be as special
Yeah,
and favored by David.
right? That's like
By God.
today. Like if you ride Air Force One, there's a good chance that, you have a claim to the presidency, right? Not everyone can ride Air Force One. It's the equivalent. Not everyone can ride, the king's mule. So it's something that would be known and would legitimize that. Matt?
Verse 30, he proclaims that Solomon, your son, will be king. So that seems to be one of the steps he took.
Yeah. He actually said that he would abdicate that day. David's going to announce, he himself announces that Solomon is king, and he's stepping down that day to give the reins to him. And then there's one more. Addie?
When you anoint someone as king, that makes it pretty official.
Right. So that's sort of almost like their swearing in ceremony, right? It says, blow the horn, say, long live the king, and this is after they anoint him with oil, right? So the anointing was a pretty big deal, right?
And you can see that people agreed with all this because they rejoiced with it.
Yeah, they rejoiced with it.
I had one other thing I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
When Jesus came into Jerusalem before he was crucified, he was on a mule.
Mm-hmm.
To show that
He
he
was.
was the king.
Yep.
Of course, the people thought by laying the palms down that they were receiving the king for Israel.
Right. Rick, did you have another?
I was just going to say, the final thing they did, too, was they sat him on the throne right then. Like you're saying, David stepped
Right.
down and they sat him on the throne.
Right.
So,
Kim?
It's interesting how Adenaija, his sort of way to take over the throne in comparison to David.
Yeah.
I mean, Adenaija is all drama and he wants a lot of hoopla and attention, and he goes in there and like, hurry up, show everybody who's boss, and make a claim as if it's real. But he was duping everyone in doing this. He was not honest.
Right.
But yet he made this whole big scene, and he sacrificed all these animals, and he had that other priest with him to make it like legit. He did all these things, whereas Nathan and Bathsheba go kind of quietly. Yeah, there was a lot of emotion there. There was a lot of like, oh no, like this is terrible. Instead of getting all caught up in the emotion and letting that take over and go in there screaming and yelling, don't you know what's happening, you old chicken or something, or you promised me, husband, and what's happened? Like, that didn't happen. It was like, let's go in there and let's just share this news.
Yeah.
And then let's take care of it. And David had the wisdom, I think, from the Lord to guide him into how to handle it.
Yeah. Matt, I saw your hand up. Did you? Okay. Yeah, and I think that's a great point. We can certainly take some applications for ourselves in the way that we approach things. I mean, this was a time-sensitive issue, right? A lot of times when we feel that we have to address a problem or handle it quickly and urgently, we don't always keep a level head. We're so worried about, well, I got to fix this now, that there's no thought put into the best way to do it, right? And while they acted quickly with a sense of urgency, they kept calm heads. They used wisdom. They trusted in God. And you notice they followed the proper route of handling things, right? Bathsheba and Nathan went straight to David. They didn't go and address Adenaija first. They didn't go to him and say, hey, you have no right to do what you're doing or anything like that. They went to the proper person. They went through the proper channels. They used wisdom to handle that. And so I think that those are good lessons that we can reflect on the next time that we have a problem as well. All right. I feel like I'm melting with a fervent heat, right? It's a sign of the end times. Whew. I'm sorry, Kim, go ahead.
I was thinking about David. David's laying there kind of to the end of his time. He's cold and, he's not really able to do as he had before. And we think about as our days are coming to a close and our health is changing and we're not able to do like we had before, but yet David rallied here.
He did,
He made the right choices, and he trusted in the plan that Solomon was supposed to be the one to replace him.
Yeah, that's another good point.
That's it. This is prove it. I'm stepping down.
Yeah.
This needs to happen.
So age isn't always a deterrent for action, right? I mean, you can still pass along wisdom and commands that can be worked through others, but leadership can still happen at any age, right? And so that's another powerful lesson that we can take away from that there. So moving on, now we get to see what the effects of all this are. So we've seen Solomon's corner, his support, and what's going on there. But now we're going to see how this impacts Adenaija, right? Question 11 says, how effective was the action taken on David's order? How does the conclusion of the conflict show the prestige of David in the nation, even in his present condition? I kind of think we answered this a little bit already with some of our discussion. We showed that the people were in agreement with this, and they were shouting, "Long live the king." They were on board with this. And then we see that David's command, David's leadership was still well respected even in his old age because the people followed it. David still had the heart of the people, and when he backed it, they followed. So that's actually the end of lesson 11. So before we move on from there, I did want to just briefly mention how does that affect Adenaija? It does circle back, and we get to see how it works for him.
He was very afraid.
He was very afraid, right? It collapsed under him almost immediately, didn't it? And I suppose that's good that he lost heart there in the end, because, he could have continued to be bullheaded, and he could have continued to try and cause problems, even though it was a losing battle. But luckily, he lost heart in that, and he gave up, right?
Solomon had some commands for him. If you do this, if you live this way, and you do that, not a hair of your head will be hurt.
Yeah.
I mean, he had his choice.
Yeah. And so there's again, lots of lessons that we can learn throughout this entire chapter, but a way to handle someone who's defeated, right? When we defeat our enemies, we can have compassion. Modern day thinking is usually when you have an opponent, you crush your opponent until there's nothing left, right? Because they could always come back and be a problem in the future. And so you just need to utterly defeat them and then go a step further, humiliate them and everything. But that never leads to anything good. Here, Solomon shows wisdom in the fact that he gives some conditions to Adenaija so that he can walk away from this. And that's helpful, right? Because if he had had no mercy on Adenaija, Adenaija could have come back and been bitter about it and perhaps try to assassinate Solomon in the future out of spite or revenge. He doesn't do that, right?
But Adenaija didn't have any support. He went away alone, and the others went their way.
Yeah.
So he actually had no support.
Yeah, no support. Yeah. So you can see how this entire situation from start to finish by Solomon's supporters and himself is all done with a lot of godly wisdom. And there's a lot of lessons for us to learn and how we handle conflicts as we work through. So I think we have time to at least begin lesson 12. If you want to turn over there. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I think it's interesting that Solomon's first ruling here is that it's very uncomfortable. This is a guy who's trying to take away what was promised to me, and now what am I going to do? And what's his reaction going to be towards me? Because now I am here on the throne because my father David placed me here, and the Lord placed me here.
Well, and their family too, aren't they?
Right, they're brothers.
Right?
So it's really awkward and it's
Yeah.
uncomfortable, but he shows, like you said, he shows wisdom and compassion. But yet he had that sort of plan B. If he shows himself, depends on the way he showed his actions and his heart.
Yeah, it's definitely a good start for Solomon. Maybe not the most auspicious start, to have to start with something like this, but he handled it well. Yeah. Yeah.
The workbook jumps to chapter 5, it looks like next, so it's kind of weird. But back to Adenaija, like you said, chapter 2, which I guess we aren't covering in the workbook anyway, he does another play, right? He tries to say, give me, after David dies, give me his girl that had kept him warm and all that, which of course in the ancient world, to have the wife of the other king is sort of a claim to the throne. So he's trying to sneak in and take the throne, and then Solomon ends up killing him. Because it's too far. You can't just keep trying this.
Right, yeah. I mean, there is a certain point when, it has to be addressed. So that's a good point. Yeah, the book, and I'm glad you pointed out, the workbook that we're going through does occasionally skip segments. And it's not that, there's nothing important to learn in those segments. It's just that it's trying to summarize the narrative on a high level. And so there are points where they'll skip over something that I'm assuming the author considers that, minor history or maybe a little bit less important. I would read that in your spare time for sure, because there's lots to learn in all of these chapters, or else it wouldn't be written for us, right? So lesson 12. Lesson 12, we're moving into 1 Kings chapter 5. And we start off chapter 5 talking about a covenant with Hiram, the king of Tyre. So that's only a couple verses there to kick it off. So let's go ahead and turn over there. 1 Kings chapter 5. And it's verses 1 to 12. And it says, Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father. For Hiram had always been a friend of David. Then Solomon sent word to Hiram, saying, You know that my father David was unable to build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the wars which surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has secured me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. So behold, I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, just as the Lord spoke to David my father, saying, Your son, whom I will put on your throne in your place, he will build the house for my name. Now then, issue orders that they cut cedars from Lebanon for me. And my servants will be with your servants, and I will give you wages for your servants in accordance with all that you say, for you yourself know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. When Hiram heard the words of Solomon, he greatly rejoiced, and he said, Blessed be the Lord today, who has given to David a wise son over this great people. So Hiram sent word to Solomon, saying, I have heard the message which you sent me. I will do everything you wish concerning the cedar and the juniper timber. My servants will bring the timbers down from Lebanon to the sea, and I will have them made into rafts to go by the sea to the place where you direct me. And I will have them broken up there, and you will carry them away. Then you shall do what I wish by giving food to my household. So Hiram gave Solomon all that he wished of cedar and juniper timber. Solomon then gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, and 20 cores of pure oil. This is what Solomon would give Hiram year by year. And the Lord gave wisdom to Solomon just as he promised him. And there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a covenant. Okay, so question 1 says, who was Hiram? And then describe his relationship first with David and then with Solomon. So who was Hiram? He owned a tire business, right? No. King of Tyre. King of Tyre. He was another king. What had been his previous relationship with David?
They were good friends. He loved, my version says he loved David.
He was a good friend. Yeah, exactly. And then how about his relationship with Solomon?
I was going to say he built David's house.
Yeah, he built David's house. Yeah.
Samuel.
Mm-hmm. And what was his relationship with Solomon?
I think he was hoping that it would be friendly as well, and he's kind of extending his hand, this kind of goodwill, by sending these envoy or ambassadors
Yeah.
to kind of fill out Solomon.
Yeah. So he sends some messengers to kind of, give some well wishes to Solomon since he's on the throne. And Solomon gets back to him and, he says, well, David wanted to build a temple and he wasn't able to, but I can, and I'm going to do that part. So I need your help because no one can produce timber like you can. And so I would like to essentially form a working relationship with you where you give me timber, I give you something in return, which ends up being food, wheat and oil specifically. And Hiram is pretty happy about that, right? I mean, he's excited to hear that there's a hope of a good relationship, just like what he had with David, right? And we'll dive into that a little bit more later, but we're actually out of time for tonight. So mark that, and go back, and as homework, if you'd like, go ahead and read the chapters that we skipped. Read 1 Kings 2 through 4. There are some good details in there, historical and spiritual lessons both. So by way of invitation, I wanted to share, last week I'd been gone because I had the privilege to travel to Holland in the Netherlands. And I actually thought that this would lead into a good invitation here. So I was able to go and visit a Church of Christ over there. This is the outside of the building. It's actually smaller than this one. And you can see that it's not a very big building at all. Inside, it looks even smaller. They only have about 30 members, and I would say that it seems like only about 20 of them are there at any given time just due to travel and other things. So it's a very small assembly most times. You can see in the far corner, they have a baptistry in the back, so that they have their baptistry tucked away there. They have a pulpit. They do have a fold-up little projector screen so they can share the lessons. And there's actually a loft to the other side that leads up, so there's a little living quarters over top. You know, some of the churches that we have here in America, there's oftentimes a house associated with the church where the preacher and his family can make an arrangement to live on occasion. That's a very similar setup that they have over there. Now, they didn't have the preacher living there. They actually were housing some refugees from Ukraine upstairs. So I thought that was really great as well. And the service is very similar to ours, even down to the number of songs. It's very similar in what they do. But they have a challenge that we don't have, which is that there are a lot of different languages that they have to deal with. When I was visiting there, personally, we had a couple from South Africa. We had the Dutch people, and some of them speak Dutch and others speak English. It's a combination. And then there were also the Ukrainian refugees who only spoke in Ukrainian. And they had a couple from Russia there as well. And they spoke Russian, which is almost the exact same as Ukrainian. So a lot of different languages there. Now, we know that the Church of Christ is meant to be orderly, so how do you deal with the fact that there are so many languages? Well, the preacher, before class started, he told me that what he does at the beginning is he takes a quick poll, and he said most people here can understand Dutch or English, at least one of the two. And so he'll ask at the beginning, who speaks Dutch, and then who speaks English, and people raise their hands. And then depending on who the majority is, that's what he preaches his lesson in. So the majority can understand the language that he's preaching in. But he doesn't want to leave out the people who can't understand, and so he prints his lesson out, and so he has a Dutch copy and an English copy. And so he gives handouts in the language that's not going to be spoken so they can follow along, which is pretty neat. Now, we had a majority of English speakers there, so I got to follow along in English until we got to the part of the Lord's Supper, because the older gentleman that got up there only spoke Dutch. He was one of the regular members, and he got up to do the Lord's Supper, and he only spoke Dutch. But he did at least know how to say in English the scripture that he was reading from. And so that was pretty familiar to me, 1 Corinthians 11:23. So it was pretty easy to open up your Bible and follow along and understand what he's talking about. And so he got up, and we did that, and we had a great lesson. And as I'm sitting there and I'm listening to the lesson, I heard some quiet speaking in the back, and it continued for a while. And I was thinking, I wonder, what they're quietly talking about in the back. And I listened a little closer, and I noticed that it was Russian. And I snuck a quick peek back, and I noticed that the Russian member of the church had quietly gone to the back and was translating for the Ukrainian refugees who couldn't understand Dutch or English. And so he was quietly, as the sermon went, very quietly, so he's not disrupting service, but he was making sure that there were no members that were left out who couldn't hear the message. And I thought that was really, really great. And even the songs seemed a little familiar. As you're going to sing out of this book in a minute here, it's the same songs, so I thought that was really great. But by way of invitation, why this really struck me is that it showed how the church is made up of many peoples, many nations, many languages, and how the love and the desire to serve God overcomes those differences. Galatians 3 and verse 8 says, the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. All the way back to Abraham's time, God made this promise. It was always his intention for the gospel, for salvation, to be made available to all peoples. Revelation looks forward into that future. And in Revelation chapter 7 and verse 9, it says, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes, peoples, and languages, standing before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches in their hands. John is having a vision of the future, of what heaven is going to look like. And those who are saved there, those in white robes, are made up of all peoples. All nations are there. All tribes, all languages are represented there. But for that to happen, we need to look to Mark 13 and 10, which says the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. All peoples want to be a part of that. All peoples have that opportunity to get saved, to have salvation. But they can't believe if they can't hear it, right? They have to hear it first so that you can follow down the rest of the steps of salvation. That's why hearing the word is the first step of salvation. And they can't hear it if no one's preaching it. And by way of encouragement tonight, I want to encourage all of us to meditate on that, to think about how our role as Christians who are preaching the gospel is so impactful. I got to visit another congregation where I got to see those actions firsthand. And it was very edifying for me to get a little glimpse of what heaven's going to be like, with all kinds of peoples overcoming their differences. Even nations who are currently at war overcoming their differences out of a desire to serve God and their love for God. And for us, we might not face those difficulties, but that doesn't mean that our job of preaching the gospel is any less important. We don't have the difficulty of overcoming language barriers usually on an everyday basis. The people that you and I are talking to, they're our neighbors, they're our family. They're probably English speakers, right? We don't have to go overcome those barriers. And so how much more should we be wanting to drive home the gospel to people? How much more should we be wanting to reach out and try and bring people to Christ? The song that Caleb has selected tonight, number 504, says, I want to be a worker. I want to be a worker for the Lord. One of the greatest works that we can do for the Lord is by preaching, is by sharing that gospel message. And so tonight, if there's something that's hindering you from being able to share in that, from being able to preach, from being able to teach for Christ, let us know. Come forward, have a seat on the front, and we'll help you in any way that we can. So if you have a need, come forward and let it be known while we stand and while we sing.